Hello, and welcome to Cambridge Uncovered, a program of Cambridge Community Television and its citizen journalism project, NeighborMedia. I'm your host, Sarah Moawad, a freelance journalist and former Cambridge resident. Cambridge is home to many racial, ethnic, and religious groups, and the city prides itself on the diversity of its residents, both those who are born and raised here, as well as those who come here as immigrants or as students. Today's show will focus on the experience of one of these groups, a community that is as diverse and dynamic as Cambridge itself, Muslims. With recent events in the news, as well as the political rhetoric coming from some of our presidential candidates, Muslims and Muslim Americans are increasingly the subjects of heated national discussions, debates, and unfortunately, misconceptions. We have brought together a panel of Muslim Cambridge residents to discuss the impact both national and local events have had on their experiences here in our city. Nadeem Mazen is a Cambridge City Councilor and the first Muslim to hold elected office in Massachusetts, as well as the founder and CEO of two Cambridge-based businesses, Nimblebot and Danger Awesome. John Robbins is the executive director of the Massachusetts chapter of CARE, the Council on American-Islamic Relations. And Farah El-Sharif is a second-year Ph.D. student in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, with a focus on histories and cultures of Muslim societies. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start off by asking how long each of you have been living in Cambridge. Nadeem, if you want to go ahead and start.
I came here for college in 2002, so 14 years.
Wow.
Yeah, we're going on 14 years.
Not nearly as long. I've been here for 3 years, but I already consider Cambridge a second home.
I've been here about the same amount of time, about 2.5 years in the area.
Okay. All right, so we have a range of Cantabrigians here. So for those of you who are relative newcomers, as well as for those of you who are diehard Cambridge residents, what strikes you about the Cambridge community that you feel sets it apart from other communities that you've lived in or been a part of?
For me as a longer standing resident, I think what drew me to Cambridge initially, like in high school when I was living in the suburbs, and I didn't come to Boston, I came to Cambridge. I came for Ultimate Frisbee, and I came for the Middle East and shows of the Middle East, and I came for street performance, and my dad came for culture, international film in particular at Kendall Square Cinema, and brought me along, and I definitely had many hours of cinema that was way over my head for sure. But there's a sense that you have big city, international scene, culture, and fun and community in a city that's very small, accessible, easily traversed by bike, by pedestrians, by people who drive, and by public transportation. And kind of all of that is packed into a few really vibrant squares with really dynamic businesses and residents. So that kind of diversity of opportunities and diversity of kind of cultural factors, I think was really impressive to me as a young high schooler coming into the world. And then, in college, obviously, I just took so much advantage of all of those things.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, I mean, as city councilor, you know better about what makes Cambridge so beautiful, and I think you've captured that very eloquently. For me, in my own personal capacity, Cambridge, to me, is a place where among the most brilliant minds of the world live here, bike here, and sort of the intellectual and sort of moral, ethical engagements that occur on a day-to-day basis in classrooms, whether they're in the diverse public schools or the wonderful universities that we have. Really make Cambridge a unique place for learning and with intellectual and spiritual growth. So that's why I love Cambridge so much.
I'm drawn definitely to the progressivism, and not just in a political sphere, but really in a social activist sense. Cambridge is a place where ideas are getting tried out that have potential to be enacted across the country, where clean water initiatives or bike-friendly systems or eco-friendly dynamics of buildings can be actually brought to the forefront in a way that's recognizable nationally and can potentially have that larger impact. And the community is willing to try that out and be engaged with it in a really meaningful way. I deeply, deeply admire that and wanted to be a part of it.
I definitely agree with everything all of you said. The kind of very dynamic nature of this city and the fact that, as we know, Cambridge is a sanctuary city, so it's open to immigrants from all over the world, and it has this very welcoming kind of atmosphere. And so I wanted to talk about the diversity of the city as it relates to the Muslim community, which we all belong to. You know, and especially recently, due to recent events, the Paris attacks, and you know, the San Bernardino shooting a couple of weeks ago, as well as the fact that, you know, we're going into an election year. There's been kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric has been amplified, and you know, especially among Republican presidential candidates. And many have linked this kind of discourse to a rise in anti-Muslim sentiment and unfortunately to hate crimes against Muslims. So I wanted to ask, how have you felt this manifest itself in Cambridge in any way? And do you feel that this has impacted attitudes towards Muslims in the city?
You might be the authority on the national backlash that's occurred, and then I'd be happy to talk a little bit about Cambridge.
Yeah, well, obviously all politics are local, but even on a national level, we are seeing this very, very broad and disturbing and troubling movement of mainstreaming Islamophobia. If a candidate endorses a white supremacist platform, if a candidate endorses an anti-Semitic platform, they would immediately get shot down. But when you have mainstream political voices that are espousing anti-Muslim sentiments, that enables those who had been on the fringes of these movements to be legitimized and to express them within the mainstream public sphere. This legitimizes all kind of behavior in the public eye that is discriminatory toward Muslims. So in the last few weeks, we've seen truly dozens and even on the order of hundreds of anti-Muslim incidents across the country that rise to the level of deep hate crimes, whether this is a bullet-ridden copy of the Quran left at a mosque or a severed pig's head thrown at a mosque in Philadelphia, Muslim cab drivers being beaten nearly to death, sick men in Chicago being beaten nearly to death after being confused for being a Muslim, Muslim mothers pushing strollers in San Diego being assaulted, as happened 3.5 weeks ago. Really, these kind of incidents, unfortunately, are reflective of a larger xenophobia that, again, the best values of our country push to the side, but when they get pushed into the center, become manifestations of this, you know, great problem at the end of the day.
And I don't want to be guilty of Cambridge exceptionalism, where it's exceptional in so many lovely ways, and I think politicians are often guilty of saying, you know, my city right or wrong, but I must say on this issue, and in fact on many issues, Cambridge leads, again. Cambridge is a place where I think all of us have felt welcome. I have gotten some messages of kind of hate speech and some messages of bigotry. I have no reason to believe that those messages came from Cambridge residents. I have every reason to believe that they came from outside of Cambridge, from people who are in that camp, buoyed by a candidate who espouses the type of fascist bigotry that the world actually hasn't seen on a political stage for some time. But in Cambridge, I think we rise above. I've had nothing personally but an outpouring of support from all angles. That's friends I've lost touch with for years are coming back, and they're saying, you know, we understand and appreciate what you're going through. This has happened to other communities, Latino community, the Black community, many other communities, and there are people coming out and saying, listen, know that now that it's your turn, it's not just, you know, a passing of the buck from one community to the other. It is an establishment of unity and solidarity amongst and between communities, and that has been very powerful here, and we've heard that from church and synagogue leaders. We've heard that from progressive faith groups. We've heard that from people of conscience and secular humanist groups. So I couldn't say enough about how much Cambridge is rising to support disenfranchised communities.
But really the fact that we are privileged and blessed to enjoy this kind of social justice-oriented, diversity-oriented community is a wonderful thing. But I also think we shouldn't paint a rosy picture of the situation for Muslims, even here in Cambridge. I think that a city as great as this is not insular. We don't live separate from the reality of the greater realities of this country. For example, a Harvard Muslim woman student the other day was verbally assaulted on the T for allegedly carrying a suspicious-looking bag, and nobody stepped up or spoke up. And to me, you could also say that, oh, they're probably not Cambridge residents. That may be very well true, but she herself is a Cambridge resident. And I think the fact that we're so privileged and educated, it demands us to be exemplars for speaking up about events that are happening in the country. And I think Cambridge is probably one of the most equipped cities in America to be brave and courageous in speaking up against things like that. And just because things are okay and people aren't speaking up, we don't know about the psychological trauma that Muslims might be facing in Cambridge, walking down the street wearing a hijab. We may not be verbally or physically abused, but there are microaggressions that occur on a day-to-day basis with people's assumptions. And, you know, Donald Trump and the GOP were talking about political correctness. I want to flip that term and say we need to have a little political correctness move in a more positive direction, where we're brave enough to ask critical questions about Western American foreign policy towards Muslim countries for the past decades and the industry of Islamophobia. And without having honest, critical conversations like these, we'll continue to perpetuate this, you know, rosy image, even though we're privileged to enjoy. I think because we're privileged, we need to push back a little bit.
And I certainly in 2013 and 2015 running for office, I mean, it wasn't a totally rosy picture, right? Every once in a while a Cambridge resident will say something that's explicitly racist and intentionally racist, and it's like, you know, I don't put these on a banner or celebrate them or even talk about them much, and I try to actually focus on the positive, because I think we're getting there as a nation with Trump-sized hiccups now and then. But I really do think this is the country where those conversations are not only positive, but for a long time have been the norm. And we have a huge number of allies here in having those conversations. These are people who were protesting, the Second Gulf War, and were protesting some of the geopolitical decisions that led to these outcomes now internationally. So, I think we have a good platform here, but we as Muslims and our allies all have to take advantage of it in order to get to the next level, or else we'll have Gulf War III and Syria II and all of these things. Like there are cycles at play in that region and amongst and between Muslims in this country, right, who feel marginalized and disenfranchised, that need to be confronted acutely.
Thank you. You guys all make very excellent points, and unfortunately it is a very profitable industry, the Islamophobia industry, which is why it is allowed to keep growing and being perpetuated. Nadeem, since you mentioned running for office, I kind of wanted to go a little bit in depth about that. Tell me a little bit about your election, what it meant for you, what it meant for the Muslim community, and what it meant for the greater Cambridge community. It's pretty historic that you're our first Muslim city council member, and the first Muslim elected for office in Massachusetts. So
I'm certainly proud to hold the role. I think it's surprising to me that I'm the only Muslim elected official in Massachusetts, and I think we have a few coming online in January. So I'm glad to be joined by school committee member Boskarts and Lawrence. It was kind of a trip, right? Because for someone like me, and for all of us, I'm sure, we have very kind of basic American interests and values. I'm looking at affordable housing. I'm looking at $15 minimum wage. I'm looking at equitable education pipelines and economic development once you're out of education and into the workforce. Cambridge is a city that ought to be able to, I think, achieve these things in a way maybe no other city can. We're small, we're a testing ground, but we're also wealthy, and we have a biotech corridor and Google and all these other businesses in our downtown. That is unfortunately not what has happened. We haven't achieved perfect equity or perfect economic mobility. In fact, in many of these cases, we've only scratched the surface of addressing long-held social ills that are pervasive in this country at large. So for me, running for office is as a Muslim American, is really about running for office as an American. Who also got involved, interestingly, because of my Muslim values, where I thought, if these things aren't being achieved, it's actually incumbent upon me as a Muslim to become involved. The Muslim is required, if certain social services aren't being delivered by a government or by social services or volunteer services, it's actually incumbent upon a Muslim to drop what they're doing and be one of the people who fulfills this obligation for goodness. It's things like feeding the orphan, or guaranteeing perfect housing, or some would say even guaranteeing perfect employment. These things are not being guaranteed by society, and so I had to do my part, even though it's not necessarily where my career trajectory was going. For me, I felt very well received by the community because of these ideological commitments and because of these policy commitments. And then learning that our Muslim community is just coming up and beginning to build infrastructure around these commitments, that was exciting. But it's also a little bit disheartening to know that, you know, our predecessors faced so much pushback in many cases simply to build a mosque, to zone a mosque, to make an entree to policymakers and be heard. That it put us a little behind, and that now, having some of these institutions in place, it's the job of all of us as leaders, I think, to build those service organizations that will actually, you know, be the soup kitchens, be the transitional housing, be the advocates, and also not just the services, but also the advocacy. Be the policymaker, be the leader. Don't just be in a photo with a photo op. We took it as a truism or as a state we could not escape from, that our leaders would just be next to the guy, next to the leader in a photo op. And we're just breaking through to a time where we have just a handful of other leaders nationwide coming into local office, which I believe is some of the most important type of office to hold, and of course folks like Carson and Ellison in congressional office. So I hope that continues, and for me, this experience of learning that it's doable and learning that there's so many in the Muslim and in the non-Muslim communities willing to promote this type of civic engagement and this type of equitability and access for our community, that for me was the real, the most important facet of this whole process.
I want to talk a little bit about, since you mentioned Muslim values and that your Muslim values played into your sense of responsibility towards your community, and this idea that Muslim values are American values and that the two overlap very much. Farah, as someone who studies, Muslim societies, and you're a Ph.D. student, what do you wish that the general American public kind of understood more about Islam and about Muslims? Because there's often this pushback that Muslims are somehow foreign or at their own entity and don't engage in the greater American kind of civic responsibility. How would you respond to that?
I think it's important first to position when we talk about Muslims and discrimination and sort of prejudice talk about them being so normative these days, we should keep in mind that this is coming from a long history of racial prejudice, and this plight that we're as Muslims having to face is a continuation of our Latino or Christian or Jewish brethren that have to endure in America historically racial prejudice. So it's not new what we're facing. They say it's a phobia, or they say it's anti-religious or anti-Islam. I really think that is very much embedded in a racialized and political dominant language which has become mainstream. And so we need to be cognizant of the political implications of the way Muslims are traditionally viewed as sort of inferior, savage-like, exotic, backwards. And so all these racial categories that feed into the media every day without anybody, checking twice about this type of language is something we need to be cognizant of. So it's definitely a racial issue, and not just simply one of immigration or assimilation, or we just want to be doctors or lawyers, law-abiding citizens. See, we're just like you. We don't want to give the impression that we're just trying to be white. The other day, a young girl in Minneapolis was telling her mother, "Why can't we be normal? Why do we have to be Muslim?" And that broke my heart, because when it reaches that point where an American Muslim child has internalized racism so early in her life, that should be a big red flag for American societies, and it should make us think why are Muslims the enemy of the day? What is all this happening? It's not happening in a vacuum. It is coming at the footsteps of decades of the war on terrorism, which yielded and this is a recent study by physicians in DC that are mostly Nobel Prize winners, that have said there are 2 million deaths that are yielded from the war on terror since 9/11. And that's not a small number. We don't think about these things. We don't talk about surveillance in the mosques. We don't talk about the Patriot Act. We don't talk about closing down Guantanamo. We sort of accept sort of the racial prejudice that's going on around us, and we shroud it in the language of, oh, we're just trying to assimilate, oh, but we're just like you. But really, we need to hold authorities accountable for perpetuating political violence, systematic racism, and not just talk about identity and culture, which is all well and good. But I think the military spending and the numbers of the death tolls don't lie. And Western imperialism is a direct cause and should be talked about in this showdown right now we're seeing between the West and Islam.
And this idea that the surveillance or that the military spending would be a Muslim issue, right, is the craziest part of all, because you have people on the right who should be looking at that and saying that spending, from just a fiscal conservatism standpoint, is literally out of control. And on the surveillance side also, if you're on the right, you should be looking at surveillance and the breach of constitutional precepts as a very serious affront to American values, right? But unfortunately, you're in a situation, and this happens with fascism, where the people who claim to be right of center socially or fiscally are then co-opting large masses of in this case, the Republican Party, and kind of disguising or refusing to discuss the true principles of conservatism that are threatening American values. And those are coming from within. Those are spending out of control. I mean, I'm not necessarily even a fiscal conservative, but we are spending out of control. We are surveilling people in ways that are unconstitutional. And we're in fact, and we can't forget this, we're in fact having our legislators pull the cover over those companies that are complicit in breaking the law. We gave amnesty to phone companies that were complicit in illegal surveillance not too long ago. These things are symptoms of a really toxic and unfortunate system, and it's not just for Muslims. It's for anyone who's on the receiving end of those implicitly anti-American programs, and those are government programs.
Exactly. We need to talk about how these issues are very much how we're very much in conjunction with other communities, how there's a lot of intersections of different oppressions with these other communities, and how they affect so many of us. And it's not just, as you said, these aren't just Muslim issues. These are affecting Latino communities. These are affecting, African American communities. These are affecting immigrant communities of all stripes, indigenous communities. So it's definitely important for us to situate ourselves in the struggles of others.
And in the case of spending and in the case of surveillance, mainstream communities. This isn't just a majority-minority type of conversation that we're heading in this direction of America as majority-minority. This is 100% of people will be affected economically by our military spending and by our debt.
I remember in high school, one of my friends said, who was Filipino, he said, this isn't new, it's just your turn now. They did it to us and now it's your turn, and he was like, there's just this cycle. But
I mean, that's been the narrative that's gotten promoted so much that, okay, hazing happens on the epic level in the US, and it's been Catholics, Jews, African Americans, Irish Americans, just the whole spectrum of individual Native Americans. Yeah, I mean, they're really
the original.
Got it the worst. Yeah. But then beyond that, that narrative seems to presuppose that this is unavoidable, or that there is something intrinsic about this that cannot be gotten rid of, or that American culture is this kind of static monolith that should not be expected or held accountable for these kind of what some might, when you think hazing, you think fraternities, right? You think kids who are just being kids and are growing up and maybe they'll grow out of it, or this is just an adolescent issue. But actually, the U.S. has been dealing with these issues long enough that it is high time that we have a national look and say, truly never again with this. Truly, this is unacceptable, full stop. And we cannot just accede to it as a Muslim community and say, let's bide our time and hope that it will wear itself out. Hope that they'll grow out of it. Hope that eventually they'll come to accept us. This is really on a national level, not the policy that the major Muslim institutions should be enacting, in our opinion.
John, I wanted to ask a little bit about the work that CARE does. For our viewers who aren't, familiar with CARE, how have you guys been dealing with, I know it's probably been a very busy few weeks and months for your organization, so talk a little bit about the work that you guys do, the complaints that you get.
Sure, so CARE is America's largest Muslim civil liberties and advocacy organization. For over 20 years, we've been in the U.S. doing a whole variety of work serving the Muslim community, and we have 31 chapters. Massachusetts is the newest chapter. We're right after Alabama, which I think is a little sad. I think we should be ahead of Alabama.
Are you anti-Alabama?
I'm a white Southern male, so I think I can put that out there, that I think Massachusetts should be ahead of Alabama in the majority of things. So CARE, we do a whole host of things. First of all, we provide free legal services for any Muslim in the U.S. who's a victim of discrimination or harassment because of their faith. Full stop. And we've been doing this for 20 years. We provide a counterweight toward the Islamophobia industry, which is incredibly well funded. We document their funding, we go after them, we stand up for those who are persecuted and victimized by them, and we serve as a counterweight in the media. We are the Muslim voice in the media, by and large. Our press release after the San Bernardino incident was viewed by 15 million Americans. Our response to Donald Trump that evening was viewed by another 8 million. And so, by and large, we are recognized as the Muslim voice, as representative of the community, insofar as it's possible to represent the Muslim community, which realistically it isn't, but we serve as a voice and a shield for that community. We do a whole host of youth programming. We do advocacy days on the Hill, such as Nadeem was a part of this past November, where we brought about 75 Muslims to the actual Hill. They met with dozens and dozens of legislators, and they expressed things like the need for affordable housing, or eradicating the school-to-prison pipeline, or justice reinvestment. So these kind of common sense bills, which really demonstrate that the Muslim community does not have this niche role, but really we are central in arguments about the place of civil society and have a place at the table as much as any other group.
Okay. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. I know it's not easy at all. And I wanted to ask, because my sister works at a hospital nearby, and she got an email from one of her coworkers, a very kind of kind gesture of goodwill, asking, what can I do to help? From a non-Muslim ally, who acknowledged that she doesn't know much, but she wants to learn. And she was asking, how can I make you more comfortable? So what would your advice be to non-Muslim allies who kind of want to show their support and counter some of the hateful rhetoric and the misconceptions without kind of overstepping boundaries or causing more harm than good?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's kind of the question of the hour in a lot of ways. As a Muslim community, it's not surprising that we're speaking out against hate speech or hate crimes, but what will really move the needle for this issue is when a whole spectrum of individuals, as we have been seeing across the country, are doing this kind of speaking out. And I mean, I cannot tell you how many personal emails I've gotten to the same effect from the Jewish community, from the African American community, the Latino American community, just the environmental activists. Truly, we tend to focus on the negatives of this, but at CARE, we're really trying to emphasize the positive elements of this. This is a time in which, if you're a Muslim, someone will go into the supermarket with you and say, okay, tell me about Islam. At no other point in history was there a door open like this to really share our faith. And for those non-Muslim allies, we ask for a couple of things. First, if they're active in their church or synagogue, maybe they can invite a Muslim to talk about their faith for 5 to 10 minutes at the end of a service over the weekend. And just say, okay, this is what I believe as a Muslim, this is who I am, this is where I'm from, this is my family, this is what we do. And there is a certain element of humanization that occurs there, which absolutely pushes any discrimination to a margin. As I wrote in an op-ed to the Globe a couple of weeks ago, hate is a long-range weapon. It can't work up close. Once you have somebody in an embrace, it's very hard to hate them. So the closer we can bring the Muslim community in this way, the more we can humanize them, and the more that we can actually initiate these hard conversations then about foreign policy or discriminatory rhetoric or even the racism underlying even the educational institutions of a place like Cambridge, then this is the way that we're really going to be able to have substantive change in a long-term way.
Exactly.
If I may be less, more unsavory and less.
Go for it.
So I think that the things John is talking about are great, but we also have to remember that in a society where our many Christians are tithing at 20%, and churches are well funded, and almost like so well funded that they're asking questions that are opposite ours. We have so many attendants coming in for Friday prayer, we're wondering where to find the space. Many churches are asking, okay, we have a full staff, but not many people are showing up. What do we do now? We're totally just coming into our own for the first time. Going to your local faith institution and asking how a landmark grant can change their operation to help them engage better structurally. If you're of that ilk and have your largesse can impact institutions that way, our institutions are in need of that type of giving. If you want to go to carema.org, I think, or jet-pac.org, we're training young Muslims to engage civically and to do some of the speaking out and some of the anti-hate speech stuff and some of the Muslims getting into politics stuff. You know, a small grant goes a long way. A large grant creates a structural solution. And you know, one of the biggest complaints I've gotten is that when interfaith allies come out to our mosques, they sometimes bounce off because we have no bandwidth. We just are putting all our time just into building the institution to 100%. Having extra time to engage in defensive or reactionary anti-bigotry speech is not on the agenda always. So I'm asking viewers, allies, friends, someone deep in your network, how can a big grant or a small donation absolutely change the way some of our groups are able to grow and to embrace all of that help in the future structurally?
Those are excellent points, giving people tangible ways to actually go about making a change. That's really important. So I think we are out of time, unfortunately. I had so many more questions. This could go on forever. I'm sure we could have a much lengthier conversation, but thank you all for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
This was incredible. And from CCTV, that is our episode of Cambridge Uncovered. I'm Sarah Moawad. Have a wonderful evening.